for anybody, you'll add the details if I forget any. I'm going to try to do it quickly enough. I take for granted everybody is familiar with Assange, but then I'm surprised at how many people aren't. So Julian Assange back in 2010 publishes classified information about American involvement in Iraq. I don't think we need to go into more detail than that. It was who provided that to him at the time? I forget the name now.
I believe they have. I mean, not all of it has been confirmed, but the government has attributed almost all of those leaks to then Bradley, now Chelsea Manning.
That's right. So Chelsea Manning, Bradley Manning, we're going to get to that. Provides classified information to Assange, publishes it on WikiLeaks. The accuracy of the information is I don't think WikiLeaks has ever published something that was inaccurate, doctored, or false. Okay, that's what happens. 6 months later, Assange is indicted or brought up on alleged rape charges out of Sweden, which provided, and I think an international warrant for his arrest is issued. In order to avoid being extradited to Sweden, he holes up in the Ecuadorian embassy in London.
Slight substitute there. Originally, he gets bail. Out of the UK. They post his bail, and he's out on bail, I believe, for actually up to 2 years while he fights the Swedish charges. At which point he's supposed to come in for a court proceeding, and he has doubts about what their motivation is, and he goes and gets asylum at the Ecuadorian embassy because he correctly anticipated that they were going to try to seize him at that potential proceeding. So so initially he's out on bail, and that's why he's ultimately prosecuted for jumping bail, for which he's already served his time now in the UK.
And that's an interesting thing, good point, because one of the issues is that apparently everybody who raised his bail funds, once he skipped bail, everyone loses that investment, that contribution or donation, which would have otherwise been returned had he showed up for bail. Correct?
That is absolutely correct.
Was it $1 million? How do you remember how much his bail was?
I think it was more than that, but if I recall correctly. But everybody who lost the money and property connected to it had no complaints because they're deep Assange supporters.
Okay, important detail. So he skips bail, ends up holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy for 7 years until they come in and they haul him out, drag him from the underarms.
The Ecuadorian embassy did a secret deal with the United States to allow him to be removed from their embassy. So they allow. I mean, if for people who don't know, an embassy is considered the territory of the foreign country. So it's almost like an act of war to go into that embassy, unless you have explicit permission from that embassy. Which it's the whole point of asylum is that you would never give permission for anyone to come in and take someone from that embassy. But the Ecuador ended up cutting a secret deal with apparently Vice President Pence and some others to accomplish that. Also, the Ecuador had a change in presidencies. And even though the left won, or considered the pro-Assange, pro-asylum side won, they have a bunch of financial issues. They're also in a constant dispute currently with Chevron involving the lawyer case that's also being prosecuted here in the States about all of the pollution U.S. oil companies caused in Ecuador, which those companies have not paid Ecuador yet or the people in Ecuador, as far as I know. And so you have a lot of political backstory going on between the Ecuador and the United States. But the most significant one was first country that I know of that allowed their embassy to be breached for someone that they had given asylum to, so that the UK authorities could remove him from the embassy. And he's been imprisoned ever since, pending an extradition proceeding to the United States.
And actually, just to bring up Archetype Next comment. So from what I understand, the Swedish rape charges were not retracted. They were eventually dropped by Sweden. And I think the explanation they gave was the lapse of time made it impossible to prosecute, not that he was innocent or whatever. There was some political spin as to why the charges were dropped, but they were ultimately dropped, or the investigation closed, I should say.
His concerns were ultimately mostly warranted. There is increasing evidence that Sweden brought. For people who don't know, by the way, people think that was like a stranger assault, or I would call it an actual rape case. The allegation was he didn't use birth control correctly.
Yeah, I think one of them was that the condom broke during the act, or that he removed it, and it's called stealthing, I think is the word that I actually learned the first time, is where the individual removes the condom or causes it to break and that is sexual assault. It's actually sexual assault in Canada, from what I understand as well. So
it's
was
rarely prosecuted because, in my view, that's deeply problematic. That should not be prosecuted as sexual assault or rape. Otherwise, my mother is guilty of it because my little baby sister was my father was under different impressions when my little baby sister was conceived. And my mother would laugh about it and tell that story for years afterwards. According to this absurd definition, she raped my father. That's why I find that a ridiculous interpretation of the laws. Not only that, it's particularly would be harmful. More women would be prosecuted than men. I'll tell you that. I mean, there's a lot of NBA, NFL players, baby mamas out there that said, "Don't worry," when it turned out there was cause for concern for potential future junior to be born.
Setting aside that, I mean, there's a more legally conflicting issue. Whereas if that qualify, if that's considered rape in certain jurisdictions, and it is, then you have California where it's a misdemeanor to knowingly expose someone to HIV. It's you're dealing with mutually incompatible concepts of law. So bottom line, he's in the Ecuadorian embassy for longer than 7 years.
Yes.
Gets pulled out. He gets sentenced to 50 weeks for having skipped bail.
That's my understanding.
And now they are having the extradition hearings to determine whether. Oh, I think we forgot one important thing is that he was indicted in the United States. What was a sealed indictment that had been sealed for, I think it was a year or 2 years, was indicted on conspiracy to commit computer intrusion to obtain classified information. So he's indicted in the meantime on separate charges in the United States. He is pulled from the Ecuadorian embassy. Do I want to touch on something? One person once mentioned that there was something about an IMF loan that preceded him being removed from the embassy by a couple of days.
Yeah. That's where there was a deal cut with the Ecuadorian government governing a wide range of disputes between Ecuador and the United States, in which Ecuador used Julian Assange as a bargaining chip to get a lot of things that they wanted monetarily.
Okay.
And Richard Grinnell was connected to this ultimately. It's which is unfortunately someone that a lot of Trumpists have support for. But it turned out that the Obama administration, they were using the Swedish proceedings to afford the opportunity to seize Julian Assange, but they ultimately determined not to bring criminal indictments against Assange because of the deep First Amendment problems of charging someone for publishing. And then people within the Trump administration went ahead with it. There's a variety of people connected to Trump that have lied to him and lied to other people in the Trump administration that misled them into believing that Assange put a whole bunch of people's lives at risk, which is completely false. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. And frankly, Trump betrayed Assange. Assange, was clearly a strong supporter of Trump effectively by being a harsh critic of Hillary Clinton. And I think people set Trump up because now all the supporters of Assange have every reason to get back at Trump between now and Election Day, which is not a good position for Trump to be in. But putting that politics of it aside, the law is that the extradition proceeding is pending, and there's a lot of law that governs extradition, that Assange has good defenses, but I do not have confidence that the judge presiding over his extradition proceeding has any intention of abiding by the restraints on extradition, and most likely will extradite Assange for what will be a show trial in the United States in the Northern District of Virginia, where their trial proceedings are a complete mockery and a joke of American justice.
So, let's do first things first. I read an op-ed today. Basically, it was a British author saying there's no way he should be extradited. It's a political prosecution at best. He's a journalist in any event and is afforded, the protection of publishing classified information that he himself did not partake in criminally obtaining. That's setting things aside. Typically extradition, there is an extradition treaty between the UK and the United States.
Yes. So for people that know, extradition there's an international law of extradition for where there's no treaty in place. And it depends on international law mostly goes by comity. Certain principles that have been adopted like common law over a long period of time become effectively the law. But there isn't a specific treaty between the United States and the United Kingdom for what people can be extradited upon request. So the United States issues a warrant for someone's extradition to that country. That country accepts the warrant or rejects it, as the case may be. And then at that point, what they do is they go in, they have their own internal domestic rules, which govern how the process works and whether there's other restraints on extradition. So I've been involved in multiple extradition cases. Some reached the legal stage, some did not. If you do your job really well, they never reach that extradition stage. The government just decides maybe this isn't the case. This isn't the hill to die upon. But the publicly represented Larry Williams while he was dealing with extradition. He's the father of Michelle Williams, the actress who was related, who was the boyfriend of Heath Ledger, had a child with him. Great actress. He's a brilliant guy. He was in Australia at the time, and we end up fighting out that extradition proceeding over an extended time period. And the same basic legal principles apply in the UK as apply in Australia. Some of your best extradition lawyers in the world are based in places like the London or Australia, but particularly London. And so in the interesting little side point about Australia, by the way, they often hire private lawyers to be the prosecutor rather than have a state official. So you can work both sides, which I think is fantastic. I think our system of justice would work much better if we did not have permanent government employees be prosecutors, but instead people were hired to be private prosecutors effectively. I think the rate of justice would go up substantially. The life experience would definitely improve. The moral compass of the people involved can't but improve, in my view. So in an extradition, you can fight it on whatever grounds your jurisdiction allows. And in the United Kingdom, if it's a politically, now normally what the extradition requires is that it be a felony, in both that the laws don't have to be identical, but they have to describe a crime that is treated as a felony in both places. If not, then no. And by the way, the same extradition principles in large part, not entirely, but in large part, a lot of the same policies would apply to the Rittenhouse extradition between Illinois and Wisconsin, which is that generally speaking, in most extradition treaties, they don't extradite for misdemeanors. Some countries will not extradite their own citizens, no matter what the situation is. Now, sometimes the way people get around having an extradition treaty, like for example, I dealt with a case where Panama did not extradite to the United States for the crime alleged. They went down. I represented my client after all this happened, but they went down and deported him from the border to a U.S. Marshal at the airport. That's how they got around all the extradition restrictions. But so the U.S. Supreme Court allowed that in a Pinkerton case where the Pinkertons went down and kidnapped somebody, and they said you can't have jurisdiction through kidnapping. There's other courts that say you can't. So one limitation can be is what's being described a crime in both countries, and is it a felony? Because most countries require the crime to rise to the level of felony, which means is generally defined as 1 year or more. So sometimes, regardless of how you label crimes, can what is being alleged be punishable by more than a year in prison in both nations? Then that's sort of you have to establish enough factual basis for that. Other defenses can be it violates your constitutional rights. It's a politically motivated prosecution. It violates some other constitutional provisions. In some cases, if you're a citizen, et cetera, and there can be other provisions that are specifically applicable to you. So for example, in Assange's case, an argument that could be raised is that what they're defining is not a crime under the UK law, because if it were, it would be a violation of UK provisions for freedom of press. There's a great movie out called Official Secrets that gets into someone who was prosecuted like Assange, not for publishing, but in that case for leaking. And ultimately, she was going to bring a duress defense on grounds that the government was up to illegal behavior, so it was necessary to disclose that. So sometimes if a defense is available in one country but not in another country, that can be an argument against extradition.
The most obvious argument that most everybody knows about is that if the person is going to be extradited to a country where they're going to suffer cruel and unusual punishment, then the country will not extradite, knowing that.
And you can expand the definition of that. Like I had been wanting to raise all the times where the U.S. has refused to extradite people where it's politically convenient as showing that there's no need to reciprocate any degree of respect to the U.S. jurisdiction. If the U.S. is not going to respect other countries' extradition laws, other countries have no need to respect U.S. extradition laws, particularly for politically motivated, incentivized cases. But other examples of cruel, unusual punishment, for some countries, that just means the availability of the death penalty. Another argument can be you look at the conditions of American prisons. The conditions of American prisons are a disgrace. You're at substantial risk of physical and mental harm if you're in our prisons. Our prison system is designed to create more prisoners, more criminals, and more hardened criminals rather than any means of just protecting the community, which is what should be their limited objective. In my view, you can argue for a punishment view, but if you're for torturing somebody, maybe you should go see a shrink. So there's a bunch of arguments that can be made on behalf of Assange. The main one is that this is a politically motivated prosecution that had been turned down by the Justice Department, first ever criminal prosecution of a publisher. But a secondary component of that, because he's basically being prosecuted for publishing information, they've just their view is if you incentivized, encouraged, or helped someone, give them the tools by which they got the information, then somehow you can be criminally liable as the person who leaked the information was. In my view, he has a duress defense available to him, just as I believe Manning should have had available to her ultimately. And so but so there's a lot of defenses Assange has. The main one is that it is a politically motivated prosecution, zero doubt about it. Now, it's not really Trump's political motivation. It's the deep state apparatus within Trump's administration that he has continued to let run amok. That he occasionally disciplines, but doesn't do so in a meaningful manner. And his people are busy not doing a lot. We can see that with updates on the Durham case. I mean, look at all the people. I guarantee, I'll predict it right now. Everybody who erased their phones in the Mueller case will face zero consequence for it. Just watch. And so it's a joke that these people are making decisions. Attorney General Barr viciously attacked Ed Snowden, said no pardon should happen for him. He should be put in prison for life, basically. He said the same thing about Julian Assange, but Barr has still failed to clean up the people he promised. Anybody who still believes in Barr should just go to the tattoo shop tomorrow and get the word SAP tattooed on their forehead, so there'd be public disclosure notice to the rest of us. But the Assange case, I think, is the worst case of what the Trump Justice Department has done. So, in my view,
and actually, I have two questions. One is going to be about the underlying theories as to why they want to get him back. But before then, it's also a very big issue in this case that Assange never stepped foot on American soil to commit the alleged crime, is not an American citizen, and I mean, I guess those are the two big ones. On what basis would the United Kingdom or Britain, England, I forgot the word now, start the E word, bring him over? What's it called?
Extradition.
Well, on what basis would they extradite Julian Assange to the U.S. when the crime didn't occur in the U.S. and when he's not a U.S. citizen? I mean,
well, exactly. I mean, it's a continuous, expansive issue. It's because the U.K. has been the U.S.'s bitch for a long time. And that's why Tony Blair went to war in Iraq on lies. And so Julian Assange is the most significant whistleblower in American history, publisher of whistleblower information in world history. There is no one that compares. He's Daniel Ellsberg times 10. Daniel Ellsberg disclosed the Pentagon Papers. If people want to go back and look at how corrupt our criminal justice process works, look at what was happening in the Ellsberg case. The FBI was secretly in discussions with Ellsberg's judge to make him head of the FBI in exchange for making sure he railroaded Ellsberg. Luckily, Ellsberg had enough key critical allies that got outed, and that's why Ellsberg was never criminally punished. Ellsberg himself has said Julian Assange is the most important publisher in the history of our country, the history of the U.S. for sure, and the history of the world, frankly. This is a guy who, what people get mad at what Manning exposed. What Manning exposed was our government doing horrendous things. And why do we want those things to be secret? Why do we want our government doing horrendous things to stay secret? That's not a justifiable basis, in my view, for secrecy. So that's Assange's main criticism, is that the worst government evils hide behind secrecy. Remove secrecy, and you're going to be able to prevent a lot of the government's worst evils, any government. And what he disclosed was extraordinary, horrendous conduct by our military in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that's the reason why Manning disclosed it. I mean, people wanted to attribute it to a wide range of reasons for Manning. Manning was just simply shocked and horrified by what then he, now she, saw. And in my view, any decent, conscientious human being would be. And so just because it's a U.S. uniform doesn't mean morally horrendous actions suddenly become okay. They don't. And Julian Assange exposed him. The only allegation is that he gave some clues to Manning about how Manning could get that information to them. That's what every publisher does.
If anybody, I did a video on this. I mean, I've forgotten the details, but I did a video walking through I don't believe it was the superseded indictment at the time, but it went through the indictment, and it was effectively, indicating how he could potentially get access to the documents. But that's effectively the extent of any involvement, even if it's proven true, of Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning. Just communicated documents, and Assange published them on WikiLeaks.
And for those out there that say that Manning or these documents caused any American to die, that's false, because that false lie was put out by deep state apparatchiks early on. They didn't even allege it in Manning's trial, and I guarantee you they would have produced the proof if it existed. So that didn't happen. So people say, well, I'm doing this. All governments say we have to lie in order to protect you. We have to lie in order to protect our soldiers. That ain't why they're lying. They're lying because if you knew the truth, you would not allow them to do what they're doing in your name. That's why. And that's what he disclosed. And that's why his criminal prosecution and his extradition is the most morally horrendous prosecution in the history of free press in the United States of America.
And, let's see here. I concur on Assange. Don't cover up. It's the same with corporate whistleblowers. Don't cover up. I know nothing of the judge who's hearing the case or of the sentiment. You mentioned earlier that it looks like the judge is leaning towards extradition. Why? Or what do you know?
She has greenlit every extradition that's ever been presented to her.
That's a problem. Okay.
Yeah. It's like, I think it's 32 out of 32. It's some crazy number. Jeez. And so I'd been in contact with people that are connected to Assange's defense. And I'd always publicly stated that I would help him out, represent him in the United States, regardless of money or anything else, because I find his prosecution so critical and so significant. It's like Rittenhouse's case in that regard. But what Rittenhouse is to the Second Amendment, Assange is to the First Amendment times 10. They're not prosecuting the institutional press for selective leaks that hurt Trump. They're prosecuting someone who did the most damage to the deep state of any person, any human being in world history. This guy did.
And now, to address one of the underlying theories, what do you say to people who say Trump is trying to get him back so that he can be safe in the United States, so he can get secrets out of him?
This is the part of the Q trust the plan stuff in part. A lot of the Q folks were telling me for years that Julian Assange was totally safe, that he was already gone from Ecuador, that he was hanging out some other place. All that was false. He's been in one of the most brutal prisons now for years. I think my problem with a lot of the Q trust the plan ideas is that it tends to encourage very smart people who otherwise independently investigate facts and do crowdsourcing of investigative journalism to not do it because they think everything's fine and kosher, that Trump's really secretly in control, that Tom Hanks and Oprah Winfrey and Barack Obama are down in Guantanamo on child abuse charges. No, and no. That the system's really in control. Well, where are those Durham indictments? Right, we're now into September, and what happened this week? Durham's number 2 person resigned because she was mad about even having to write a report before Election Day. Do you think she's resigning in protest of writing a report if they're about to bring a bunch of big indictments? Do you think Peter Strzok's out on a book tour because he has any reason to fear anything? No, the reality is the Assange prosecution is a deep state prosecution. Trump and people close to Trump were hoodwinked into supporting it. And it's an embarrassment. It is contrary to Trump's core values for him to do so. He publicly praised Assange throughout 2016. I hope that he will return to that and pardon him, because the message of the Assange indictment is a deep state power grab that says that if you publish our dirty, dark secrets, we will put you in a hole for life. And that's why it is Assange is symbolic of everyone's freedoms, for freedom of press and for us to know what our government is up to. He published the only publisher to not ever get anything wrong. He, by the way, went to great lengths to make sure things were not illicitly published. When other people got access to the cables and they published them without his approval or authorization, he tried to give notice to the government so they could take corrective remedy before it got out publicly, because he wasn't the one publishing it. He just was tipped off to it. So he's been very noble in his publishing attempts, has tried to mitigate all forms of harm, has his own personal peccadillos that doesn't always leave him with the best friends and allies around. But that's the nature of an idiosyncratic independent soul. He's the Thomas Paine of the modern world. And for anyone to sit by and watch him get criminally prosecuted in the name of the deep state is not a true friend of democracy or freedom.
It's going to be. I mean, from a timeline perspective, what do we think we have to wait before we get a judgment?
They're going to have multiple presentations of testimony and hearing. I think it will be mostly a show trial by that judge, but her decision is appealable, and there is a fair chance that someone up the food chain in the UK recognizes how problematic this is and does something about it. But I would say 1 in 10. And I think his only likely remedy, the U.S. court system, the way they prosecute national security cases in the United States are a joke. They're an embarrassment to our constitutional liberties. You're not meaningfully afforded the opportunity to cross-examine your witnesses. Things are done in secret in massive degree. Think about the Roger Stone trial, but make it on steroids.
Yeah, well, people don't, I know that I'm more sensitive now to the nature of the UK court system because it's much like ours, and ours is already one step above yours in that respect. So people should appreciate that.
Just look up what's happened to whistleblowers, and if you have any idea or any doubts about the intentions of Assange, look at what people like William Binney have said about him. Look at what people like Daniel Ellsberg have said about him. The greatest whistleblowers in American history have all celebrated Assange as key to the ability of whistleblowers to have a voice in the future, and that means the people's right to know what our government is up to and when they're up to bad stuff. This is a deep state case. This is the deep state case of all cases.
Amazing. Okay, well, we'll see where it goes. It is fascinating, and if anybody's not familiar with how UK courts can go dark overnight for an extended period of time, Tommy Robinson was another situation where mind blowing. Where at the time I said, love him or hate him, this is a North Korean style court system, not the beacon of democracy of the Western world. Mind blowing. But we'll see. There hasn't been news on that in a long time. But yeah, if anybody doesn't know.